being an institution that can host them. So thank you to our members in the room. Okay, so now I will introduce you to your speaker tonight. Bonnie J. Ruff is an award-winning author who writes on topics such as parenting, education, and gender equality, and is the author of The Girls Alone and Carrier, Untangling the Danger in My DNA. Her work has appeared in several anthologies, including the Best American Science and Nature Writing, and numerous periodicals ranging from the New York Times to Brain and Child. Her new book is Beyond Birds and Bees, bringing home a new message about sex, love, and equality, and it's the subject of tonight's talk. It's been out for a couple of weeks, and it's received national coverage, including the Chicago Tribune. She was on the Brian Lara Show on WNYC, and has been on a number of outlets here in Seattle. And her latest piece of magazine journalism in The Atlantic is on the relationship between sex ed and gender equality, which ties deeply into some of the themes that she'll be talking about tonight in this book. Please give a warm Town Hall Seattle welcome to Bonnie J. Ruff.
Thank you all. Thanks so much for being here tonight. I'll just come right out and tell you that I never imagined I would write a book about sex. I grew up Catholic, not too far from here in Redmond, a middle-class American suburb where when I grew up, there was one stoplight and it smelled like cows, so, pretty pastoral. And I babysat all the time and wrote a lot of long, frilly nature poems, and I always waited 30 minutes after eating before jumping into the pool. So despite commendable efforts by my parents and teachers, I was expecting a punctuation mark for my first period, and I thought my breast buds were tumors. By the time I rolled a condom onto a banana in my high school health class, I knew I wouldn't be repeating the exercise anytime soon. In college, I never thought to take a gender studies class, nor did I give a lot of thought to why gender equality is so important. I never read or asked questions about how my body worked. And I will just go ahead and tell you, I'm just going to admit it because it's in the book too, I had 2 entire daughters before it finally occurred to me to look up the answer to a pesky little question. What is the difference between a vulva and a vagina? I know none of you guys have that question, but you can tell your friends the answer's in the book. All I can say is that gender equality wasn't something I'd spent much time thinking about, and the birds and the bees just weren't my focus. When I became a parent, I figured those details would somehow sort themselves out for my kids, perhaps with a nice pamphlet on a day when I planned to be out of town. So tonight, I want to share with you how I went from a mom who could hardly put the words kids and sex in the same sentence to one who would be proud to have them grace the cover of her next book. So here's the story. In 2009, when Dan and I were the parents of a single little girl who was nearly 2, we made a big move. We said goodbye to Minneapolis, where we'd been living, and we moved even farther from our hometown of Seattle, all the way to Amsterdam in the Netherlands. We settled into the canal house we'd be calling home, got ourselves some big, awkward bikes, and started learning our way around this new culture. So, if it looks like we were having fun, yes, that's because we were. We did get to do this kind of thing all the time, and also eat tons of cheese and pancakes and licorice and apple pie, and play in a countryside full of windmills and sheep and tulips. Holland, which is the other name for the Netherlands, really is as adorable as in the postcards. But like any new parents, we were also in a delicate phase of life. My husband Dan and I were trying to figure out how to raise a kid. And right away, I started noticing some things going on around me that I found rather strange. So for example, here's a picture you got to preview a second ago. This is, folks hanging out at the neighborhood playground, which is familiar enough, but then I started looking a little closer. Yeah. I had come from playgrounds where it is a parent's job to hover. It's the American way, right? But here, moms and dads brought novels and coffee and booze to the park and hung out with their friends while their kids pretty much ate sand and skinned their knees and fell off of things onto their heads. And weirdly enough, everyone seemed really happy and relaxed. It took a little while to realize that these parents were not being careless with their offspring. They cared a lot and actually were very affectionate with their kids. Instead, within safe parameters, they were working hard to give their children independence and teach them self-reliance. And given the stress I'd felt in early parenthood, I found this kind of dreamy. Sociologists were finding things to like too. They were ranking Dutch kids as the world's happiest, healthiest, and best educated, and their moms and dads as some of the world's least stressed and most satisfied parents. In other words, the little parenting tips and tricks I was noticing weren't just random quirks. They were adding up to a big social impact. Okay, so as you can imagine, things like not overprotecting kids at the playground makes sense, right? But more to our point tonight, I noticed some other odd things that I couldn't so easily explain. These things had to do with how families, caregivers, health workers, and teachers taught children about bodies and relationships. First off, well, and by the way, I should say, at the time, I did not know that this is what they were teaching. I just saw them doing this weird stuff. So first off, people were really comfortable with nudity, and I mean really comfortable. Parents let their kids swim naked in the giant wading pool in the big park in the center of the city, and that didn't end when your child turned 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you just, whatever you're comfortable with. And families, too, were generally comfortable with nudity at home. They wouldn't hesitate to shower together, for example, and talk about it, right? So, and then we were told that in Holland, if you close your blinds, it means you have something to hide. So we, as a family, did our best to get used to being a bit on display ourselves. That was awkward, but also kind of refreshing. And the thing about Dutch nudity, I eventually realized, is that they have this idea that there's a gigantic difference between everyday non-sexual nudity and erotic nudity. That fascinated me. I wondered if that distinction had gotten somewhat lost in my own culture. So here's something else. I noticed that at our daughter's preschool, we were hearing a lot of careful attention on language. As they helped the children with toilet training, our daughter's teachers chose their words carefully. Diapers were full or wet, but never dirty or stinky. They wanted to instill positive connotations for body parts and functions, and they knew this could begin with language. The teachers also used exact anatomical terms for the children's body parts, all of them, as they helped them learn to be independent with their care. And then another thing I couldn't help but notice in this super sweet, cute little preschool, there was just one bathroom. It had a little row of potties side by side, maybe 3 or 4 of them, and no dividers. So kids of all genders could use the bathroom together at any time, and that was normal. Oh, and lest you think that mixed gender bathrooms are just for preschoolers, let me add that at our neighborhood gym, so picture your local YMCA, the pool locker room was one large space for all genders. There were stalls if you wanted privacy, but you couldn't get picky about who was changing next to you. So eventually, I saw that from their families and teachers, picture books, and even television programs, children growing up in Holland were learning from an early age that bodies of all kinds are normal and nothing to be ashamed of, embarrassed about, laughed at, or teased over. And then to top it all off, even though my child was too young for this still, I kept hearing that school sex ed lessons started in kindergarten for kids as young as 4 years old. And all I could think was, I do not think so. What could that possibly look like, right? And then this one, I really didn't believe at first, but I was also hearing that it was normal for Dutch parents to consider allowing their teenagers to have romantic sleepovers with boyfriends or girlfriends at home in their own bedrooms. This made no sense to me. The Dutch had an extremely practical, no-nonsense society. Why would they even think of letting their teenagers have sex? So while I was noticing all of these things, I realized something else was going on. Another thing was different, and that was me. For the first time in a very long time, I noticed feeling simply wonderful in my body. I couldn't remember a time since childhood when I'd felt so comfortable in my own skin. Many of you will probably know what I'm talking about when I say that it's common for many American girls and women to go through life feeling watched, evaluated, and judged on the basis of their appearance and their choices. That gaze was comparatively absent in my day-to-day life in the Netherlands. Without it, I felt more connected with the people around me, and in many ways more creative, energized, and free. To put it simply, I had never felt more at home in my body as a woman. Yet I lived out my whole expat experience in the Netherlands without figuring out what it was that made that feeling so possible there. By the time our stint in Amsterdam came to a close and we moved home to Seattle, Dan and I were expecting our second daughter. As we re-immersed in American culture once again, just as when I'd moved to a foreign country, new things started jumping out at me. This was pre-Me Too, but now more than before, I found it clear to see how American boys and girls were offered such different experiences from an early age. Everything from toys and clothes and books to sports and subjects. And I was starting to see for the first time how those influences contribute to a difference in power and influence for men and women in America. So I'll be honest, I spent some time feeling really afraid. You know, those hazy newborn days. You sleep a lot, you snooze, you wake up, and I was having a lot of nightmares. I couldn't picture how I was going to raise my children to live shame-free in their bodies in a culture that profits off of girls' and women's low self-esteem while keeping boys and men boxed into a narrow definition of masculinity. And I quickly found out I wasn't alone with my fears. Many of my friends, people raising girls and people raising boys, were expressing similar concerns. We all wanted the same basic things for our kids. We wanted them to grow up happy, healthy, and safe. We wanted them to always be loved, respected, and free. Specifically, we wanted every opportunity for them to meet their potential and succeed. When it came to their bodies, parents were saying it was important to them to raise their children to be proud and comfortable with themselves in a society that respects people's rights, boundaries, and individuality. But none of us felt confident we knew how to get that for our kids. I thought back to that amazing feeling I'd experienced living abroad of complete, almost childlike contentment in my own skin. I'd felt it slipping out of my grasp, and I knew I wanted that feeling back. I wanted it for myself, but now I also wanted it for my children. And I wanted them to have that feeling not just as children, but for their entire lives. And I wanted it not just for my children, but all kids. Everybody should have that feeling. So that's when I started really doing my homework. I wanted to know more concretely what exactly Dutch parents, caregivers, and teachers were saying and doing to create that shame-free and egalitarian atmosphere I remembered. And by the way, eventually I found wonderful examples here at home in the US too. So I want to just say right now that creating those outcomes turns out not to be a Dutch-only opportunity. But at the time, I only knew one place to go look. I had to wait a few years, but when our youngest was old enough, my family started traveling back to the Netherlands as often as we could. Now, with a journalist's lens, I began to explore what the Dutch approach was teaching that I, as an American parent, might inadvertently leave out. On that very first return to Amsterdam in 2013, when our kids were 6 and 2, I had the first of many aha moments that led to Beyond Birds and Bees. I'm sure you've all heard of the Pacific Science Center. Yes, of course. So it's a science museum. It's designed for families. Plenty of cities have them, including Amsterdam, where it's called Nemo. So this is a fall day in 2013 when Dan and I decided to pop in with the kids. And Nemo, of course, has all the usual science museum stuff. But also, they had a section upstairs with lots of pink and red velvet and neon with a big sign that said, Teen Facts. This was a permanent exhibit, all about puberty and human sexuality. We kind of had to decide as a family, are we going in here? So, yeah, okay. So that's me. That's a picture of me. And I'm just wondering if anybody wants to guess what I'm standing in front of there. What's that brightly lit tank on the wall, that long tube full of viscous white fluid representing? Any guesses? Yeah, I'm sure you're all guessing it silently in your head, which is, yeah, it's supposed to be a giant tank of semen. 53 liters. What's the significance of that number? The average amount that a human male produces in a lifetime, of course. Come on, kids, have a look. Okay, can you tell what these people are doing with their arms in those giant tongue puppets? That's a French kissing diorama. Yeah. And they're having so much fun. This is just a still, but you can see a video that they project up on the wall at Nemo. It's this remarkable animation about puberty where these two little kids walk into this kind of X-ray machine that follows their progress from the age of 7 until they come out at 16 on the other side. And yeah, it's just remarkable. If you're curious, I can tell you how to find it on YouTube. And there's yeah, that video I sat and watched next to some 8-year-old kid I didn't know who eventually kind of got bored and wandered off. But while his mom was over reading a display about acne, I was like, ooh, I got to get to that one. But yeah, it's all this and more. I include all the good parts in the book. But for now, suffice it to say, it was fun and it was funny and it was awkward. The thing is, as a parent, I already wanted to be open. But at Nemo, around a bunch of families who were totally unruffled by teen facts, I felt my hang-ups on full display. I couldn't ignore the irony. There I was, a married American mom in her mid-30s who had just spent an afternoon learning all manner of sex facts from an exhibit designed for children. It was sinking in for me that the heart of the Dutch approach is simply this: normalization. By putting it all out in the open from an early age, we can teach that human sexuality is normal. Doing that creates opportunities for us to tackle the really important stuff about bodies: how to care for, enjoy, respect, and communicate about them. So now I was hooked on this learning journey. And that's when my most mind-blowing lessons started coming one by one. I started discovering approaches that made me want to completely transform my ways of thinking, talking, and teaching about human sexuality. I had the incredible experience of visiting Dutch and American classrooms where I saw the future of sex ed in world-class lessons for even the youngest grade schoolers. Yes, even kindergartners. It made sense in the end, and it is a beautiful thing. And as I continued my research, I found out so much more about what Dutch parents, teachers, and caregivers do when they're faced with all manner of kid moments, like when a preschooler seems to spend a lot of time with their hands in her pants, or when young friends are discovered with their pants down playing doctor. And I don't want to spoil this one for you, so I'll just say the rules are different in Holland. And what about when teasing seems to cause a cherished boy-girl friendship to begin dissolving? Or when a third grader tells his teacher he's in love with a classmate? or when puberty hits and self-esteem is on the line, or when a teenager bravely tells a parent that they're thinking about sex. What I discovered is that kids everywhere think and do and experience many of these same things, and no matter what country they live in, parents worry, a little or a lot, and we ask really similar concerned questions. But I discovered, to my great surprise, that the Dutch approach offers different answers than I had ever heard for each of those scenarios and many more. I found these answers incredibly refreshing and child-centered. There's absolutely no doubt that every caring parent answers their children's questions from a place of love and a desire to protect. But I noticed that the Dutch approach somehow, at the same time, managed to keep fear in check in a way I wanted to emulate. Their responses to their children came first and foremost with practicality, logic, and lightness. I got the feeling that the teachers and parents I was observing fully expected birds and bees conversations to come up again and again, so they didn't have to try to get it all done at once. So you might think all of this openness and permissiveness would lead to complete debauchery and intemperance, like in one of those horrible spring break reality shows. I've never watched those shows. But honestly, things in Holland just kept on looking like this. Yeah, cute sheep, and like this. In fact, I found out some interesting statistics. Even though Dutch and American teenagers become sexually active at around the same age, between 17 and 18, American teens have babies at more than 5 times the rate of their Dutch peers, who also catch fewer STIs, have fewer abortions, and fewer partners. Simply put, those Dutch take fewer risks. And I was really astonished by this. Dutch people, women and men, are twice as likely as Americans to characterize their first time having sex as a positive experience, one they fully wanted and enjoyed. Twice as likely. As I learned all this, something else was finally starting to make sense. The normalization of human bodies, sexuality, and love, and all of the little daily ways that I write about in this book that Dutch caregivers and teachers reinforce body positivity, knowledge, and autonomy aren't only at the root of these exemplary Dutch sexual health statistics. These approaches are also at the root of gender equality itself. I found out that the Netherlands consistently ranks as one of the topmost gender-equal countries in the world. In the most recent United Nations Development Program Gender Inequality Index, the Netherlands ranks 3rd from the best, whereas the US does not even crack the top 40. It finally clicked for me. That was why, living there, I had felt so comfortable and worthy just the way I was. Imagine what it felt like for that to sink in, realizing that in the everyday work of raising kids and teaching them healthy attitudes about human sexuality, we as parents, caregivers, and educators have the golden opportunity to help the next generation pave the way to greater gender equality. As simplistic as it sounds, and by the way, sexuality educators out there have been trying to get us to hear this for some time. It's true. Gender equality begins with great sex ed. It begins at home, it continues in school, and it's woven into the fabric of a society whose young are taught that bodies are normal, individuals are unique, consent is sexy, and an egalitarian way of life works better for everyone. So as you can imagine, as I was learning all this, personally, I felt like I was racing the clock because, you're finding out all these great ideas, which means that you had never thought of them before, and the clock's ticking, the kids are getting older. But soon enough, I learned what I already should have known, which is that it's never, ever too late to start new conversations. I mean, look at me, case in point. I had these huge revelations in my 30s, and now I knew for certain that sexuality does unfold over a lifetime, and any one of us can find new values and make new beginnings at any stage. My opportunities to observe the Dutch approach gave me a kind of permission to be freer, more open, and more trusting when it came to talking about sexuality with my kids. I discovered the thrill of turning fears about my children's sexuality into hopes and dreams for them. I learned I could stop being afraid that I might say too much. And you know how people say it gets easier? You know, the more you do it, it gets easier, just keep trying. What I learned is that the easier it gets, the more fun it is. Like, it goes beyond just being easy once you start to weave these conversations into life and let your kids know that those lines of communication are open. It's actually fun, it's fulfilling. So it's that sense of permission and encouragement and joy that I wanted to reach out and share. So that's the naked truth about how this goody two-shoes got writing about sex and how this book baby got made. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. I was hoping we could meditate on those beautiful tulips for just a couple more minutes. But while we transition to the stage, we would like to invite up our panelists. Amy Lang is a sexuality and parenting expert and a regular guest on multiple media outlets. She has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Salon, CNN, The Atlantic, and the Seattle Times. She's the author of Birds, Bees, and Your Kids and Dating Smart. And they'll be joined by moderator Nicole Brodeur, a featured columnist for the Seattle Times, who interviews media personalities, big thinkers, visiting artists, colorful characters, and doers of all kind. They'll have a conversation about some of the ideas we just heard, and then we'll open it up to your questions. When we get to audience Q&A, if you could come down and make a line up in front of this microphone and use this to ask your questions so we can all hear you in the room and pick you up for the archival recording we're making tonight, that would be great. Now to our panel. Thanks so much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Bonnie, for asking us. Thank you, Amy, for being a rock star.
Thanks.
Thank you for loving your kids enough to be here and feeling weird, but here we go, right? It's all good. I think I've made it through this minefield, but my kid is still in his 20s, so maybe I'll have to be back for something. I don't know. Anyway, it's all good. I just keep my fingers in my ears and go, la, 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 la. So I want to start with the basics. Why is it so hard to talk about sex education? Why is this such a difficult conversation? Sometimes harder than talking about money or whatever. It's a tough one, and I just wanted to ask you both because you've been doing this for a while. Who wants to go first? Amy?
I'm
Amy
happy
Lang?
to go first. I think a lot of it has to do with what you were talking about, how we were raised, how we were parented around sexuality, and we didn't have good examples growing up. And so then here we are, parents, and we're expected to be really good at all of the parenting. And then here's this thing, sex, that we don't understand ourselves really in a fundamental way, and then we're expected to be like, oh, sure, no problem. Let's just talk about how babies are made, penises, vaginas, vulvas. And so I think that what happens is it's happening in our own families, and then it's cultural, right? Our culture is very puritanical. We don't talk about sex. We see sex all the time, but we don't talk about sex. And so I think it's sort of not sane, really, and crazy making and uncomfortable. And so the easiest thing for us to do is to say, you know what? They'll get it at school. It'll be fine. I turned out okay. My kid will be okay. Please don't ask me anything. And if you do, I'm going to make up some reason why I can't talk to you.
Okay. So go ahead and answer, Bonnie, but then I'm thinking maybe the question is, what are we really talking about when we're talking about sex?
Sure. Yeah, just to kind of continue what you were saying, Amy, it's been so interesting for me to take a look at the culture I was raised in and try to kind of understand how is it that we live in this puritanical sort of culture, yet at the same time, sex is splashed everywhere. So what is that about? It's kind of like a mix between that old-fashioned, conservative sort of reserve that many of us feel, and then next to that, this fierce, independent, free spirit, like I can say whatever I want. And so what happens is I think we just get this really sort of flat, shallow definition of sexuality. We think, well, we do talk about sex. We, I don't know, had a quick conversation based on that ad we just saw, and that's what sexy means or something. But again, like that's a really one-dimensional way of looking at sex and sexuality. And one of the things that I got to learn about in the course of writing this book is how to take that definition that we use for sex and just blow it up. I mean, I can think of the introduction to a book for kids, it's in Dutch, that, 10-year-old or so, and the whole introduction is, what is sex? And it says right at the beginning, sex is for everyone. It's for you, it's for your parents, it's for et cetera, et cetera. And then it goes on to describe how our sexuality is growing from the time that we're babies, and it has to do with being able to be comfortable and enjoy our bodies, being able to relate with others, knowing our boundaries, knowing theirs, knowing that we must respect those boundaries even if ours are different from someone else's, decision making, thinking about inclusion and diversity. So all of that gets wrapped in with the definition of sexuality. And it's not just, coupling, reproduction, body parts, done.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about gender equality. I mean, you can talk about Serena Williams today. You can talk about any number, something comes up every day, thank you to the president, but about,
He's not invited.
He's not invited. He's like, whatever.
Well, if
Okay.
only he'd had better sex ed.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay. All right, problem solved. Okay, sorry.
All right.
Sorry, we digress.
Zippity-doo-dah. I'm not saying a word. Okay, but that's part of it too. And one thing that struck me about your talk is that you said we don't just sit down and have one conversation and take a kid in the room and have the talk. It's a series of conversations. So I want to ask you a little bit about just that approach, what parents can do, and look for your chances and your openings and your conversation starters with your kids. But let's talk about just some basic tools that parents can use.
Yeah, like jumping off points.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, you probably have some favorites.
Well, they're
Let's-
endless, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
if you think about it, they're endless, and it kind of depends on the age of your child, too. So I think if you put sexuality education on the same list as like, okay, my kid needs to know how to read, and they need to know how to go poop on their own sooner, better. They need to know how to take care of their bodies. They need to know what healthy eating looks like. So if we think about sexuality in the same way, we have these casual conversations about, the difference between white rice and brown rice. So why not have the casual conversations between the difference between being circumcised and uncircumcised, or how babies are made, the usual way babies are made versus the other ways babies are made, right? It doesn't always take a penis and a vagina. It definitely takes a sperm and an egg. And so opening our eyes to these moments where there's an opportunity for us to talk about something related to sexuality and then taking those moments. And I think the biggest lesson from the Dutch is that they have sex ed in kindergarten, in school. Can you imagine that happening here? Anybody? Anybody? Anybody?
We do have a new curriculum out there that is... It's there. It's usable. It
exists.
It exists.
But the problem is that people are afraid to use it. And so I think that's the beauty of what's happening with the Dutch and the Dutch culture, is that they're showing us how we can do this in a way that feels casual, that feels normal. And one of the things I talk with parents a lot about is, like, your kids don't know that if you're freaking out, all you have to do is poker face and have a glass of wine and talk about the uncomfortable thing. They're not going to know that maybe you even came up with a script to explain the difference between A and B, or what, something hard like rape is, or something like that. They don't know. And I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to perform really well, but our kids don't give a crap about what's happening in the background, and they don't need to know what's happening in the background. So like read Bonnie's book and you get this great insider look at what it's like to be an American in this culture that I wish we all had. And then, you know, look for opportunities to have the conversation and then do it. Anybody here have a vaginal birth or any kind of birth? Hand in the air. All right? So if you can do that shit, you can have a sex talk. Like, that is hard, but you've done hard stuff. And even if you haven't done that, if you've witnessed it, you know it's hard. So anyway, I digress. Thoughts?
I think that, you know, what you're saying about kind of taking, we're unlucky. We have this unlucky inheritance, this cultural inheritance that for a lot of us really blocks us from, and also, I guess I have two little things I'll say here, but I just want to say in response to what you asked earlier, Nicole, about that block that we have, we may be just that generation. I mean, the Dutch had that generation, right, where the parents said it kind of happened for them right around their women's movement, which was different from ours because men were more involved. And then, you know, the generations just started to change their approach. So I often think, okay, maybe I'm the generation who, you know, has to control my voice a little bit, but my kids, when they talk to each other about sexuality, since they are given that opportunity and have that license and expectation, they don't seem to be, you know, having just sucked down helium. So
Yeah.
maybe it really is just, you know, we're the generation who does it uncomfortably, and we let them be the generation who's, you know, I don't know, maybe lets their kids swim naked in the park. I'll leave it up to them. But yeah, and then the other thing I wanted to say is just about those other opportunities. You know, I love what you say about having sexuality be one of those kind of tracks in life. Nutrition is such a great example. I mean, you just don't visit that once, do you?
No, repeatedly.
But
Yeah.
then also not to forget or to give yourself credit when you find out, oh, this is also part of nurturing healthy sexuality. When I say you need to ask first before you poke your brother's, you know, penis in the bathtub, and if he says yes, you know, then we can talk about that. But so consent, reading stories about. You know, like you were saying, Amy, not just the one way babies can get made, not just a super heteronormative idea of what a family looks like. All of those things contribute to attitudes of egalitarianism, inclusiveness, and autonomy, and just, I think, from what I see, and even from what the CDC tells us about what comprehensive sexuality education curricula do, we are actually teaching kids the skills to produce a more egalitarian society.
I like hearing that, but I'm having this other kind of a random side thought of just how charged the issue is and how other parents can get in the way of our best intentions. And, you know, if you're walking around your house naked or whatever and your kid has a friend over, you know, what does that mean? Or if another child hears something from your kid, you know, all of a sudden there's this sense of judgment and like there's something wrong with doing that. So I love this whole idea of, you know, wine in the playground for starters, and
Winners.
but also just that, you know, the ease with which the Dutch would, what you saw there. But here, it feels like it's a tough go of things, especially when people are upset about every little thing. You know, parents are, you know, helicopter parents with a capital H, and, you know, maybe we were a little puritanical in the past, and now we're just won't leave our kids alone. Am I making any sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you are.
So how to do this, which I think is great, and not, and in, you know, kind of break the mold here. It's a big fat question, but I think I've got two people, so I think they can handle it.
Well, we have to talk to each other as the grown-ups
Yeah.
in the room.
Absolutely.
You
have to tell your...
You have to text your friend. The kids are playing naked in the yard. Is that okay with you?
You have to tell your friends, hey, my 4-year-old, we just read It's So Amazing. They know all the deets. And you tell your friend group. And then your friend group goes, oh, terrible. some of them, nobody here.
Or if you're like my friend Mary, you're like, you're welcome.
Yeah, right. Or they're like, yeah, we're already there too. So if everybody's kind of knows what's happening and you warn the adults in your life, like the grandparents really, oftentimes struggle with this. Like your 5-year-old knows the correct names for private body parts. I didn't know a penis was called a penis until I was 19, right? So like we're parenting differently in general, like helicopter-y in special snowflake land is one thing.
There's a lot of that going around.
I don't know anything about that.
Okay, good. That's because you were in Dutchland for a really long time, not Deutschland. Yeah. So I think if totally agree with you. Like, talk to your peers. Like, how are you handling this? What are you doing? And don't be afraid to be an outlier. You know, Carrie and I, my spouse and I, have been outlier parents, and it's hard. You know, we wouldn't let Milo have a smartphone until he's a senior now, but we couldn't have a smartphone until 9th grade. He did not like that. But did we care? Not much, right? And who's really respectful of his smartphone use? Who had to buy his smartphone? So it's like, you have to be uncomfortable as a parent. Like, parenting is uncomfortable straight up. So now, why not parent around your values and be uncomfortable? And if your value is no sex talks until they do it at school in the 5th grade, then rock and roll. But be prepared, because your kid's gonna be getting lots of information from kids like your kids who are gonna say, oh yeah, that's not a vagina, that's a vulva, and there's a clitoris, and it's the best thing ever, right? So, I mean, really, I think in my years of working with parents around this topic, our kids are not a problem.
Interesting.
Fill in the blank. Yeah, fill in the blank. So I don't know if you have more thoughts.
I thought that was
you
perfect.
watched it, right? I mean, I'm just so envious that you were there, you lived there, and you saw it in action. Because I know this all theoretically, but reading your book was just, I'm having chills actually. It was so neat. I mean, you're such a good writer, so that's always helpful. And it was just so cool to be like, oh, to see what it was like in there from an American perspective. We have very similar backgrounds. I was raised Episcopalian, so next best thing to being Catholic, and in similar communities. So it was just really neat to be like, okay, this is really what this is like. And I know some of you here have been hanging out with me for a long time, and I practice what I preach, so does my spouse, and fingers crossed that our kids are like, yeah, whatever, it's fine, why are you being so weird, right? That's what we want, our kids to be like, okay, cool, I got it, why are you being such a freak show? Because I was not raised right. Sorry.
You were raised hilarious. That's how you were raised. I just wanted to ask you, there's a chapter on consent, and we're kind of jumping all around, but I'm thinking that the Q&A section of this evening, and I'm looking at all these faces going, we should cut this short and let these people talk, but we'll get there. We're jumping around a little bit, but I wanted to there's a really good chapter on consent that I think kind of covers a lot of the ground it touches on a lot of these different things we're talking about tonight. But some examples of how parents and teachers can teach and model consent for young children. And I'll give you an example from the book. Bonnie wrote about things that fathers said to your daughter, like, come on, you did it last time. You didn't mind it before. Come on, you can do this.
Not their father, just
a father.
Friends.
Yeah. And it was things and you're creeped out of your mind reading this, and then it's things that other dads said to her when they wanted a high five or a fist bump. They were just urging her on, and she didn't want to do it. And then there was another part about, there are things like unwanted chasing in a playground where someone doesn't want to be chased, and someone just wants to be left alone. And tickling also, same thing. So I think that I look at these things and go, oh man, I was a horrible kid, I tickled everybody and chased them and did all these things. But I wanted to talk about how parents and teachers can teach and model consent for young children. How do you do that?
Yeah, great question. And by the way, if you think you were horrible, maybe, I don't know if you saw this part.
I wasn't horrible.
But and then there was me in 4th grade who, for some reason, thought that a great thing to do was to continually spank my friend at school.
That's right.
Until the morning she turned around and put her knuckles right up my nose. I learned my lesson about consent, sort of, but not explicitly. It happened sort of, it was impressionistically. But yeah, we can actually spare children that bloody nose by letting them know, literally in lessons, that they should ask before they touch somebody else's body. And yes, there are gray areas and fine lines and that kind of thing. And that others should afford them the exact same respect, that they should be asked before they're tickled or roughhoused with or tackled or whatever. I mean, there's sort of an implied kind of consent to being tackled, say, if you are playing a contact sport or something like that. But that's there and it's implicit. But yeah, tickling is huge. Like, how do you tell grandpa that we're doing this differently now, and if the child is saying, no, stop, when you're tickling her, actually you have to stop. Like, it's kind of hard. It's hard with others. But again,
even saying to your kid, give so-and-so a hug.
Oh, that's
or
a great one, yeah.
I never do that.
Yeah.
I always said to my kid, you don't have to do that.
Right.
Like, give me a hug, give me a kiss. And I'm like, chill. They'll live without it.
So, even with my kids, it's hard because they're so kissable. And yet I try to say, can I give you a hug? Can I give you a kiss? And instead of, just laying it on them.
I think that's the best thing we can do for our kids is to model consent, which is saying, can I give you a hug? Can I give you a kiss? Hey, grandma would like to have a hug. Would you like to give grandma a hug? And if the child says no, then you respect that no and you wait for the yes. And frankly, grandparents really don't like to be told no and don't like to be told we ask permission first before we touch our kid because we're modeling consent. Sometimes they don't like that. Lots of people don't like that. And the reality is if your child learns at home that people ask first before they touch you in any way, that's the standard, what you just said, that's the way it is, then they do better and they're more likely to be able to say no. And then if somebody violates their boundaries, they'll come to you and say, hey, Uncle Creepy didn't respect my boundary here. And I think one thing that we can do as adults, which is something I do as a safe adult, is that if I meet a kid, sometimes parents will say, this is Amy. She taught me all about how to talk to you about sex. Give her a hug. And I'm like, okay, I don't know where to go with this, but I don't ever hug or touch a child without saying, hey, can I give you a hug or a high five? And as kids get older, we understand, like if I do this to you, you know what I'm doing, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't want me to touch you, you'll do something and I'll respect that. But chances are really good you're gonna let me hug you even if you don't want me to touch you, right? And so we have to really think about, like, what are we teaching our kids? Like, consent is agreeing. It's not saying no, right? It's that whole yes means yes thing. So asking first, and even like being aware of your physical body. So if I say, can I have a high five? Sorry, I'm just going on a little rant here. Can I have a high five? Right? I gave you this big visual cue, so it's really hard to resist me. But if I say, hey, Nicole, can I have a high five?
No.
Yeah, a lot easier, right? So I'm into minutia, but bottom line is ask first. Really easy, really easy. Just ask first. And then that translates later into when a child's becoming sexual in their, what do we discern? Late 20s, right? So when they're like starting in their first relationships, they understand consent in this kind of fundamental way. And it's like, hey, can I kiss you? What do you think about, may I touch your breast? It's a little belabored, but we want our boys and our girls to understand, like, consent means yes.
One thing I think that is people who can talk to each other that way are in relationship.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I learned from Dutch parents and American parents who are, following a different model, is that they're looking to support their children in relationships that maybe be sexual relationships that are real relationships, that are healthy and balanced and respectful and communicative. So having that conversation is more than just a transaction. Although we can, if we want it to be less easy but more fun, actually develop the conversation even more, right? To what you were saying, yes means yes, so enthusiastic consent. So what's that? That's not just saying yes you may, that's saying yes, I want it. You don't have to use those exact words, but that's the idea, that's the sentiment behind enthusiastic
Your child will
consent.
never say that. So
Yeah, I mean, I think there are times too when I ask for a kiss or a hug, and it's sort of like, fine. I'm like, well, that might not be enthusiastic consent.
Yeah.
Do I hug? We're not crazy nuts about it, but we try our best to model consent. And then also, you mentioned those kids getting older, and it's more than just tickling, and we have these nuances that come in. Can a person who is drunk consent? What do your friends think consent is? Do people who are married, do they need consent? Things like that. The questions and conversations just get richer.
And richer.
One thing that I think is important is with kids, especially when you share your own experiences with things that happened to you when you were a kid, or how you handled something when you were younger. There is an example in your book about someone massaging an adult massaging your shoulders, and you getting up and walking away. You weren't comfortable with them doing it. I've had stuff like that happen to me, and I've actually shared those experiences with my son to illustrate, like, you can pick up cues from people, and you know when to not do something, and ask, But I think one little portion of these conversations that we have is to be sure to share things from your own life and things that happened to you and how you handled it. And I think it's important for our kids to understand that we went through this stuff too, and it was a struggle, and we learned, and here's what we learned. Even though they may not listen to what happened, they want to have all these experiences on their own. But that's one thing that I think really keeps my son and me connected, is that I share a lot of stuff that's happened to me, and even now with relationships and girlfriends and all that stuff with him. So anyway, I just want to throw that in there as an old lady.
It makes me think of two things, actually. One, what you just said about consent is something I really want to make sure we add to the conversation, because you just reminded us to talk about nonverbal consent, or so it's not just about words. We have to teach our children to observe what other kids are saying with their bodies, with their eyes, with their nonverbal sounds. That's all part of consent. It is not about saying yes or no. It's about being in communication, real human communication with the person in front of you. And then I really just think so many parents are afraid to talk to their kids about their experiences. Maybe they don't feel good about them, or I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I love that you share your stories with your son, and I also would just like to just add a word of caution. I think it's a really great place of connection, especially sometimes with dads and daughters, because for some reason, dads tend to step out of the sex talk, kind of relationship talk stuff, sexuality talks, and let it be mom's job, which I think is cultural.
With both boys and girls?
Maybe that's not true, but I kind of think it is a little bit, just saying. And so one of the things that we can do is use our stories from when we were kids. Like, I remember I had this big crush on this girl or this boy, and this is what happened, and talk about our experience in that way. But my word of caution is this: I personally don't believe our children need to know about our traumas. So if you were sexually abused as a child, if you were raped, I don't think it helps our children to know that. I think they need to see us as whole and healthy. And later, when they are in their mid-20s or in their early 20s, when they're more mature and can handle that sort of information, that conversation, I think it's better for them. But you can say you had a friend who this happened to, because you do. I know you all have a friend who had an abortion or was raped or whatever, right?
My kids know about my abortion.
Right, and so that's fine. I mean, that's fine, because that probably was not a traumatic experience for you, so I probably should not have piled that in there. So I retract that A word. But just think before you speak. There's lots to talk about, there's lots of examples, and there's lots of ways to share and engage with your child. But remember, and this is my value about this. Like, I'm not going to share the shitty shit that happened to me as an adolescent and a young adult with my kid, because it's not going to serve him now. He's 17. When he's in his 20s, we'll talk more about it, maybe, and maybe not. and maybe not. So it's a personal choice, but my belief is that they don't need to know our traumas. It doesn't help them. Life's traumatic enough. They need us to be like solid, whole, et cetera. And I know people don't agree with that, and you know, your kids, your life, your choice.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, because I can think of some examples of friends who felt like they had a reason why they wanted to let their kids know that this can happen, and it happened to me at like kind of an age-appropriate time. And those are friends who seem to really kind of know the language that they wanted to use, so they were able to really get it just right for the level that their kids were at.
Right. And I think that's entirely possible, and just proceed with caution, I guess, is my, my philosophy, right?
I just have one more question, and then I think we're going to do questions. Can you give us some examples of how good sex education helps gender equality? What does that look like?
Well, we have, first of all, I can give you some concrete examples so maybe we should do some terms. I don't know if folks in the audience have heard, the word sex ed can mean anything from comprehensive sexuality education, which is the gold standard, to something called, lately they call it sexual risk avoidance, which translates oftentimes to abstinence only until a heterosexual marriage education. And so, it's important to know what kind of sex ed we're talking about. And when I talk about great sex ed, I'm talking about K through 12 comprehensive sexuality education, where I saw kids learning at the ages of 5 and 6 and 7 about identifying the gender stereotypes that they already held and had formed, and having their teachers help them break those down. Wait, so put the toys that the boy can play with in this pile, and put the toys that the girl can play with in this pile. Okay, why can't the boy play with those other toys? And just kind of slowly helping kids or wear those other clothes. And then again, like also teaching children tolerance is one of the key tenets of sort of the national, education in the Netherlands has a central government oversight. So they have 3 things that they want kids of every age to be working on in sex ed from the time they're 4. They want them to be learning about how bodies work. They want them to be working hard on having excellent, what they call sexual assertiveness, knowing their own boundaries and knowing that they have the right and skills to protect them. And finally, working on any ideas that would contribute to what they use the word homophobia. We would look for a more inclusive term that acknowledges all sexual diversity. But again, those are written right into what kids need to be learning. So they're breaking down gender stereotypes. They're learning that gender is fluid and can be very individual. They're learning that attraction can have all kinds of forms, and that people have the right to feel pleasure and enjoy their bodies no matter who they are or how they identify. So they're teaching tolerance from the get-go. And that's one way that egalitarian mindset builds for those really young kids. But then again, too, they have, let's see, you were wanting to know about how gender equality builds. The other thing is that our own CDC tells us that there are factors that increase or decrease the risk of someone perpetrating sexual violence. And so if we teach kids those risk protective factors, such as empathy and how to make a decision together with another person, which are built right into the best comprehensive sexuality education curricula, we can actually help reduce the incidence of sexual violence.
What she said.
It's so exciting for me.
I know, I can tell. And it is exciting. So if we think about sexuality education as a whole, back to the nutrition thing, right? If we think about it as this whole broad spectrum of things, all the things you just talked about, when we're thinking about gender equality, if everybody's getting the same information and the same kind of respect and the same support around consent and understanding how bodies work and pleasure and what feels good and all of the things that go along with sex and sexuality, that's going to balance things out. But one of my big big things is something really, really small when it comes to gender equality. It is language. It is language. And sorry, my husband is going to be like, I'm leaving now. We refer to groups of people as guys all the time.
There was just a great article out about this.
Yes, it's also in my blood. So if we mind our language, that's going to help. It's a tiny thing. There are lots of words we don't use anymore to refer to groups of people, and I'm not going to say any of them. So instead of saying guys, say folks, say y'all, say people, say humans. There's a ton of different things. Or if you're feeling really radicalized, say gals. Freaks people out. And people.
Ladies.
Don't say groups of people, ladies. Sorry, let's not go there. So if you think just that tiny thing when you're talking to your kids and you say, hey, people, and it takes unlearning, let's go, like, hey, guys, to a group of girls, they're not guys. I mean, I'm sorry, that word is gendered. It's never going to be ungendered. And so just like those little tiny things can really help with gender equality. And so also I'm going to say one more thing about this. Also really, I think when we really start to focus on women and girls' sexual pleasure and the female body, and if we can all just say the word clitoris, let's just say that, shall we? Clitoris. Yeah, people. I know, gold stars. Like, if we can start talking about girls' bodies and women's bodies and pleasure in a way that puts, like, them ahead of men's pleasure, like, we know sex feels good to men, but girls don't always know that sex is supposed to feel good to them. Like, those little things. So stop saying guys and start saying clitoris.
Okay.
Let's go.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.
That's true. I just want to tag on to that. Just one other thing that got me so excited about how gender equality can build. When I saw that cooties don't appear to exist in the Netherlands, so kids after preschool, I always thought, okay, that's when boys and girls segregate and are no longer friends because that's the order of the world. Like, that is nature. We can't. Wrong. Parents and teachers in the Netherlands, and again, built right into, parenting advice and curricula, give lessons to their children or have conversations, and everybody's like, but teach them that relationships with friends of all genders are important and help us all to live better together. So they are working hard to reinforce their children's cross-gender friendships right through middle childhood so that those kids aren't strangers to each other when they meet again in adolescence with hormones in the mix and manage to stay friends into adulthood. That really, I thought, was amazing. And the way one mom put it to me about how powerful that is, she said, we got to find out what was different together. Isn't that a beautiful thing? All right, kind of sentimental, but I loved it.
It's a nice spot to ask for questions. So, how are we handling this? Oh,
So
great.
this microphone here, it would be great if people are able and willing to come on down and ask questions from this mic so we can all hear you. You can just come on down and make a line. I think I see one question here, maybe one more there.
Oh, hi. I'm co-raising a 14-year-old girl, so it would have been nice if you could have written this book 13 years ago.
Sorry.
It would have been very
Can
different. But
I interrupt real quick? This light here is blinding, so if you can move the microphone over, please.
Perfect.
So we can actually see people. Thank you.
anyway, my 14-year-old stepdaughter informed me that she should be on birth control pills because it's a feminist thing. And I'm grappling with that, and I told her I'd think about it and weigh the pros and cons, and I thought I'd ask if you have any opinions on that.
I think she's awesome.
I think you're
I do
awesome.
too, and I have.
I think it's great that she's asking you.
Yeah, that's
anyway.
it. That's the ticket. You have those open lines of communication with her, so you guys can look at the pros and cons together, right? You can explore what that's about, and I mean, if it helps at all, I don't know, in your relationship, how much this means that you suspect she may be becoming sexually active or wants to, but gosh, the more you can keep those lines of communication open by listening and having that conversation with her, the more likely she is to come to you for advice and support so that she makes good decisions. And I guess it's probably worth saying that one of my biggest, I don't know, kind of one of the most encouraging and reassuring things that I learned about teenage sexuality was to think about teenagers becoming sexually active not so much as a matter of when, but how and why. If that's a positive experience, to me that's more important than timing. Now ask me again when my kids are older and I might say something different, but I really hope not.
Yeah.
So
Sort of, I guess, a follow-up on that is, I've always, like, very tiptoeing, like, I don't want to grouse her out, you know, I think a dad could do that very easily by talking too much about the plumbing. But I don't know if she should have a vibrator or something like that, or if I should drop her off at a
You are awesome too.
store. Well, I'm scared to death, and I don't, I mean, I know it's a fine line.
I feel like we should give you a round of applause. We'll just hold it. Yay, go Dad. So I just want to touch on the birth control thing. Yes,
Yeah.
it is a feminist move.
Yeah.
So she just needs to be really well informed about it. I used to work for Planned Parenthood, so if she's had her period for more than 2 years, and it's something that you talk to the provider, I would go to someplace like Planned Parenthood where they're really seeped in every bleeding
Right.
birth control pill out there. And because it is really empowering for her to go and have that experience with your support.
Yeah.
So conversations need to be had, obviously, so you're already doing that. Research, go together, and figure that out. As to the vibrator thing, so my take on that is girls need to learn their own bodies, and when you
Right.
bring in extracurricular items,
Right.
it can be really overstimulating, and most of the time when we're having sex with ourselves or with someone else, we don't have apparatus.
Right.
So I would say just say, hey, you know, masturbation is great. It's really good to know your own body. And if she asks, then you can say, you know, you can do that. But I personally believe it's better for girls to just take care of their own business.
Right.
And also they can become dependent on that. Not everybody agrees with me, but I just think, you know,
Okay, that's,
she's well equipped.
not being a woman, that insight was very good.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Yay, Dad.
Yay, Dad.
And just really quickly, I forgot to say, we only have about 10 or 15 minutes, so please try and keep your questions brief and in the form of a question. Thank you.
Hi. I have boys that are 5 and 7, and my 5-year-old recently, he pulled a girl's pants down, and we addressed it as you cannot pull people's pants down, her body, her rules. And also he keeps punching his brother in the penis lately, and I've been saying it's not okay to touch other people's privates, it's not bad. I use Amy's language, it's not bad, it's for when you're older. And my 7-year-old said, when you're 14. But I wonder, we talk about consent in other areas, and should we just be moving to consent? Like, I don't know, in those things, or is it just a hard line? No?
It sounds like you've been doing a really great job.
Okay.
And the language you're using is lovely. One thing with the penis punching and all that, he's probably getting a lot of attention for it. So oftentimes and 5 is like the time for this kind of stuff. So you might want to just mind like when he does it again, just monitor yourself. And you can just say, dude, what's the deal? Like, you know the rules. Go find some other way to entertain yourself and be a little stern, because it's not okay to punch somebody's tallywhacker, right? I mean, it's probably attention seeking, and so if you can find another way to wrestle and talk about it, and I know the Dutch have a different philosophy about private touching and that sort of thing, but I would just guess that he's getting a little rise out of you, so maybe pay attention to, like, are you paying attention to him enough?
That also makes me wonder, is something else, is there a puzzle piece that isn't in the picture yet? And it makes me think of, kids when they're a little bit older, or even around that age, say using potty language, or when they're older, teasing other kids about body parts and using sexual words to be mean or as jokes because it makes other people laugh. Those are signs of confusion, I think, in children. So I almost wonder what might happen if you just flipped it all the way around and said, hey, let's go look at this awesome book that has great penis pictures in it and see, did you know about these parts and why that might hurt or why you should ask first or whatever. But I don't even know if it necessarily needs to go into addressing consent. It might be, this might be a way of asking for information.
All right. Yeah. Perfect. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello. I'm going to put this up. Hi, gals.
Hello.
I was wondering how, I
Thank
think, sure. It seems like we do not a very good job here introducing the idea of sex for pleasure. You know, we tell them it's you make a baby or you get a STI. That's pretty much it. So I think that's usually, hopefully not the case most of the time for us adults. But I'm wondering when and how, what did those conversations look like for the Dutch kids? What did you hear?
I mean, I was looking through parenting pamphlets for children, for babies up through 18, and for those little babies, you know, let them, when their diaper's off, let them explore, be, you know, encouraging parents to be cheerful about that and let kids handle their own bodies and get to know themselves from a very young age. And the advice for parents is to smile upon that and remark upon it if you want to. Doesn't that feel good? As opposed to, you know, because we spend a lot of time here on that risk message, and we don't balance it out very well with a positivity message. And there's a good reason for that. Historically, here in the US, we became much more aware of child sexual abuse in the 1980s, and so the literature that came out, both for professionals, but also for just in children's books. Our children's books, it was so fun to compare what we give to kids or what we can find in the library compared to what, you know, a Dutch 2 or 3-year-old might have on their bookshelf. But our books are largely about keeping kids safe, which is great, but the balance is gone. There was a symposium of experts that came together in the 80s to talk about how we were going to educate kids, and they made a point of saying we need to make sure that our protective efforts are balanced with teaching children that sexuality is healthy and positive and you know, a useful and wonderful aspect of human life, and it just didn't work. It got lost. It got lost in our culture. It got lost in our literature, and I really hope it comes back because that's such an important question you're asking.
And so I'll answer it as well.
Your videos are great about this very topic. They've been very helpful to me,
Thanks.
so thank you.
YouTube, thank you. Yes, they should know that it feels good to touch their private body parts. And then right when you're talking about, I mean, I think that using the baby making is the easiest entree into talking about sex, and just say right off the bat, and it feels good to their grown-up bodies. Sex is something people want to do when they're older. They do it because it feels good. It's a way of connection. And then you just drop the bomb, and it feels like a bomb to you. It's not a bomb to them. Yeah, it's not a bomb to them. So just take care of it. Really simple. It feels good to their grown-up bodies. Moving right along. Sex feels good. And then they know that. And you have to keep saying that over and over again. And then eventually you have to say, no sex for you, but, you know. Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Hi, I have the 13-year-old son who took Flash. Do you guys know what Flash is? It's like
My
sex
kid
ed,
took that
right?
too.
He literally put his arms in his shirt, pulled his hood over his head, and hid for 5 days and would not talk to me about it. My husband and I are really sex positive. His sister's curious. And he came to me one night, and we were like sitting in front of the TV, watching TV, and Every Kiss Begins with K came on, you know? And he goes, no, Mom, every kiss begins with consent.
Oh.
And I was like, touchdown.
Yes.
And I said,
Parenting win.
I'm like, okay, so what does that mean? And he said, going along with what somebody wants you to do. And I'm like, damn.
Close, but no.
And so how do you work with kids who just don't want to talk about it and they hide? And I mean, we're like completely relaxed. We use humor. We try to incorporate it in everyday language, and he is just not interested.
So part of that's developmental and his personality. Someone at my house told me he'd rather talk to strangers than me or his father about sex.
Yeah, that's what my kid is.
Yeah, so you just have to say, I get that you're uncomfortable, but you need to know this.
Okay.
And then use TV and movies, and there's a great video, Consent is Like Tea, that might straighten him out.
Right.
and just say, we're going to talk about this whether you want to or not. And you get really good at sneaking it in.
Yeah.
And no one dies, no one throws up, right? And it's your job. And so just acknowledge his discomfort. There's lots and lots of books. And just hang in there. He'll come around. He
His
can't.
sister's like totally
Right, so
asking
use her.
Yeah, I
Use
mean, we'll
her.
like pull him into the
Yep,
conversations.
use her, like ignore him and talk to her all about erections and like, like all of it. And he will or he won't come around, and you can only do what you can do.
Right.
But yeah.
Because I was that shy kid too. That
Yeah,
didn't,
so, right, so you just can't, like, again, you can't like not do this. I mean, you
Right.
can not do this, but it sounds like you don't want to not do this.
Yeah, I want to like.
Yep, so
get
just
in there
push
somehow.
on.
Cool.
He won't die.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Hi. If you're talking with a group of teenagers about the difference between sexual harassment and somebody just displaying interest in you, what are you going to talk about? What are the warning signs?
So you're talking about that scenario where we used to say to kids when they would come home and tell us, oh, that so-and-so keeps like pulling their hair or touching them or something, we used to
Right.
say, oh, that just means they like you.
Yes, but
And now we don't
this
say
is more
that
about
anymore?
the young adults who
Okay.
are about to enter the workforce. This
Sure.
is all about Me Too.
Okay, so and so the question is if people are actually trying to express affection in a way that is coming across, that is not wanted by the recipient. I mean, I guess I'm not sure. That doesn't sound complicated in the sense that, we need to make sure that everybody, no matter who they are, is informed that they are empowered to say, no, I don't want that. I don't want to be touched by you. Now, it is so complicated when the perpetrator or the person who's doing the unwanted thing is in a position of power over you. And you're describing what sounds like a peer group, and gosh, it just seems like making sure that young people know that they can and should say no if it's not wanted. Maybe I'm missing something on that. But
I mean, I would also say, like, are you trying to help them understand the difference between, like, flirting and sexual harassment? Is that what you're thinking?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think one of the things to note, to remind all of us, should be reminded of this, is to remind them to trust their gut. So if it feels wrong, it probably is wrong. And so if someone's flirting with you and it's unwanted flirting, help them to have a script to say, hey, I like you, but not like that. And to have some ways of some refusal skills that are predetermined. But that trusting your gut thing is huge. I mean, I think most women have been sexually harassed, and sexually harassed in their workplace. And like I certainly was. And at one point I turned around and said to my boss, who just said something really crass to me in front of one of our coworkers, did you just say blah, 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 blah to me? And he went, and turned around and walked away from me, never did it again. So making sure that the girls and the guys are empowered to say, like, hey, that's not okay, and also really trust their gut. I knew it was wrong what was going on between me and this boss of mine, and I finally got fed up. And I had a different conversation at some point, like, I know this is wrong, I need help, and enlisted the help of a coworker, a help of an HR person, or come up with a sassy pants way of saying, dude, knock it off. So I don't know if that's helpful.
It is. I think one of the things is that women are taught to they deal with it on the spot, and maybe the clarifying moment I'm wanting is, when do you report it? When do you know that person?
I think it's position of, do you know about this more than we do?
oh, do you mean for you as a man, like as
No, when does she report it? I think if they're in a position of power.
Yeah, absolutely. If they're in a
Yeah.
higher
Position of-
level
yep.
position of power, if there's any kind of feeling of threat or anything. But I agree with Amy. I think that you know it in your gut when it's not just a playful, guys say things to me one way and I hear it from certain men, and then I hear it in a different way from other people, Does that make any sense? They know, and that sounds like a lame answer, but I think it's true. I think it's
And I'm just gonna
especially the power
talk,
part.
'cause I know there's
Have
other
they been
people
watching
waiting.
all the Me Too stuff and reading? And that's it's been amazing.
So I'm
Just
wondering what the
read all
advice
these
is that you give
stories.
to the men, to the boys, to the men.
Yeah.
You're answering it for women.
Yeah.
But what advice do you give to the boys and the men?
Yeah, we just, I mean, we're kind of.
I wish I
do
knew a little
that.
bit more about the situation, like if you're in a position to counsel them or, but yeah, I mean, who is giving this advice to them if it's not the person who they're harassing? But they need to be educated that it's not acceptable. It's not a matter of women trying to just get away or men just trying to get away from a harasser. Obviously, the word is out. Like maybe there's even shorthand now, you know, hey,
And in the interest
we're in
of-
Me Too time.
And in the interest of time, if you'll just email me, and I'll see what I can drum up, because I've got lots of resources, and nothing's coming up and if anybody else has a resource, that'd be great. So it's amy@birdsandbeesandkids.com, and I'll find you some help. It's a really great question. Thank you for asking. All right, we're going to be
It's
efficient.
like stump the panel.
I know, I know. It's a good question. We live in a complicated world.
Hi, I'm wondering about the culture of shame around STIs that we have in the United States and what alternatives you've seen to that in other places. We have a culture of like, not only is this a dangerous thing that you should be aware of, but it is dirty and it is gross, and these people are dirty and these people are gross, you need to stay away. So I'm curious what alternatives there are to that.
Well, and we kind of have we have a culture of shame around unwanted pregnancy too, right? Where, you know, having an unwanted pregnancy is not supported. You know, if somebody decides to have a baby, they're not supported in that. If they decide not to have a baby, you know, they don't get supported in that. It's just all bad news. Oh, you got pregnant, now it's all over. I mean, I definitely saw examples in the Netherlands of how, and I've seen good examples here in the US too, of how unwanted and teenage pregnancy can be supported, although we just do not have a safety net for that. And around STIs, I think there are some really good curricula out there so that when students are collectively getting information, there are some, and we can talk about that if you want, where I mean, there are definitely some really bad ones that want to go out of their way to make STIs just sort of sound like the worst thing imaginable, whereas the truth is, most of those infections, you know, on the list in the curriculum are treatable, and it's important to know what they are and how they are transmitted, but there's no, I mean, yeah, I don't know, I guess I think that the more we talk about it, the more we are educated about it, the less of a mystery it is. Again, normalization. And probably when that happens, we reduce the incidence of STIs as a nice side effect. So.
And just being matter of fact about it. Like when you have sex and you don't use condoms, you have sex with somebody you don't know very well, there's a good chance that you might get an STI. Some of them can kill you. Some of them are lifetime companions. Most of them are treatable with antibiotics, and just sort of your attitude about it. But like, it's not a great idea because sometimes you can't know. Especially guys can have infections and not know. We're a little, those of us with the lady parts, I didn't say that, have a different experience. So I think I really agree with what you just said. Like, education is key. Mind your tone, and mind how you react if you hear your kids say, oh, so-and-so's got chlamydia, and you say, oh my God, right, terrible, should have used a condom. Well, chlamydia is like the common cold of the crotch, right? Like, it just say, oh, that's a bummer, how did she figure it out? And then talk about it in a matter-of-fact way, just like she has the common cold of the crotch. So anyway.
Matter of fact.
Matter of fact. Maybe not common cold of the crotch, but you know what I mean. That's funny.
Hi. I have a 5-year-old, and up until about a year ago, I was like, I'm so on this. We talk about consent, we talk about body parts, we talk about all of this stuff. And at that time, she was really into playing Naked Ladies, which was a common game around our house, and the other parents...
It's a great game.
It's a great game. The other parents were fine with it. It wasn't a big deal. She got into playing doctor. You know, it happened with most of her friends that came over. No big deal. Until I got a phone call from one of the friends' moms who basically informed me that they weren't actually just playing doctor, they were playing gynecologist and colorectal surgeon with implements. And so after I got over the shock and fear of, oh my gosh, did she learn this from somebody who has abused her, and went down that road and felt fine that that had not happened, I found myself in this place of how do I talk to her about this without invoking shame? And how do I talk to her about consent, which I think her friend reluctantly gave consent in this case. And how do I prevent her from doing this with other kids, which it did happen with other kids. And of course, every time she had a play date, I would warn those parents, keep the door open. This is a game that has been played, and I don't know how comfortable you are with it, but I don't want your child to feel violated. So,
I'm going to do this.
yes, if you have advice or how the Dutch would deal with this, I would love to hear.
You dealt with it very much the way the Dutch deal with it. And the problem now is that because of that it kind of went over the top with the gynecologist and all of that, that it's really important that you not shame her. Some of the language I recommend parents use is that it's not okay or safe to play games with private parts. Kids can get hurt. They're a very sensitive part of her body. And she's old enough now to know that, she can learn about this stuff from books and that sort of thing. So the piece of this is your tone, right? So if you use a shaming tone, then she's going to feel bad about what's happened. But if you use a calm, matter-of-fact tone, because the play, you're going to end up with a family that is not going to be so down. And we don't live in the Netherlands. And so we live in a puritanical culture that thinks, there are people in this room that are thinking, oh my God, your child was sexually abused. From the sounds of things, and it sounds like you really looked into it, she probably was not. Things just kind of got out of hand. So mind your tone. There's some really good books that talk about playing safe games. There's one called I Can Play It Safe. The book, It's Perfectly Normal, and It's Not the Stork, has really good sections about this. But really clear, like, you're old enough now, it's time for these games to stop. People are weird, they feel uncomfortable. I don't want you to get hurt or hurt someone else. And then that lovely little, you're old enough now to know, puff up. So that's what I would say. It sounds like you've handled it pretty well. And then keep an eye on her behavior, right? If she can't stop, it becomes compulsive, that might be a problem. If it's happening with the same kid all the time, so there's some things you can watch for, but it sounds like you're on it. And one thing you might do is also just play dates at your house until she chills out, right? Because you're going to pay attention. You can't trust the other parents. No offense, other parents.
Well, and one thing that I think is wonderful and hard that you're doing is talking with other parents. So I had that situation when my daughter was 4, and I love what you say about tone and getting that right, but I still couldn't figure out how to say, no, you can't do that. And part of that was because I wasn't sure I believed that. And so I happened to go just after she kind of started playing games like that to the Netherlands for a research trip. And when I was there, I found out, like you were asking, how the Dutch respond to that. And in a way, it kind of answers your concern of going too far. I asked this expert who is a curriculum writer there, and she said, oh, Dr. Spelen, we have rules for that. Boom, hands me a pamphlet. And so I will go ahead and tell you what the Dutch rules are, which I did bring home and tell my daughter. The first is you already have this rule. Everybody has to agree it's a nice idea to play. The second rule is you may not do pain. And the third rule is nothing in any openings. Not your nose, not your anus, nothing in any openings. So when I told my daughter that, I had a lot of the concerns that you were raising about other families and what are we going to start here. So I added a fourth rule, which is that you ask your friend to check with their family and see if they have the same rules.
Great. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. It's a tough one.
And unfortunately, we are running pretty low on time, so this is going to be the last question.
Okay.
Hello. I do not have children yet, so I don't have to worry about any of these things for a long time, hopefully. I am curious what the two of you saw from the other side as you were doing all this, so from your kids, like how you saw them react or grow or adapt or have questions or not get confused based on what their friends were being told or not told? Like, what did you see from your children?
So what I saw from Milo was that he was I practiced what I preach. We read books with him from the time he was 3 years old. He's known, one of my goals for him was that he never have a memory of learning how babies are made. So that was one of my goals for him. And he definitely has that goal. He knew how babies are made. He knew about puberty, knew about all this stuff. And he's a very private person. And he got to 5th grade, and it was time for Flash, and I was like, he's going in, he's already full, and he gets in, and he's like, it's like the first weekend, and I'm like, so, how's it going? Super cash, right? And he says, oh, Mama, you cannot believe the questions they are asking. They are so dumb. And I was like, yes, because he knew the stuff already, and he felt weird because he had more information than everybody else did. And then Flash gave him permission to be informed. And, you know, once your kids get into like 6th grade, like middle school, like just stop screening. They're gonna see it all, just talk about it all. It's not gonna hurt them. So that was my like big like moment of like, oh, look. And he felt so good because he knew so much, right? So that's what I noticed. What have you noticed?
That's awesome. Okay, fingers crossed, because I was just thinking I am going to hit the pill tonight and be like, oh my God, I'm so behind teaching my kids about bodies and sexuality. But I feel like I live with that feeling like probably most of us do in some ways. And the repetition that you talk about is so, so important, because I don't know if anybody here has had that experience where you tell somebody, okay, here's how babies can be made, and then find out 6 months later they're like, you never told me that. And then 6 months later, same thing. So the repetition being so important. I mean, for me, the really wonderful experience that I've had was, you know, we live in this tiny Ballard house with a kitchen table in the middle of it, and that's not just where we eat, it's where I spread out my work and write books. And so my kids over the years, you know, from the time they're learning to read and practicing their reading skills on my articles and drafts and these books that I have piled up, and English and Dutch, and there was no way to not have them asking questions. And, you know, what is love making? It's like, oh, well, that's not the same as how babies can be made. That has to do with emotions and relationships. So, you know, realizing at first, oh my gosh, I wish I had covered that page up, and then realizing, no, that's a great opportunity, like we were talking about earlier, finding those good opportunities to have those talks. So in a way, I inadvertently created an environment where we would have a lot of those cues and prompts. My kids have looked through this book front to back. They know the parts that they're in, and they're proud of the message.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nicole Brodeur, Amy Lang, and Bonnie Ruff. You can pick up copies of Beyond Birds and Bees at the Finney Books table right over there, and Bonnie will be signing books. Thanks for coming.